there's a lot of people in the Bigfoot community who I think either got into it from just a general interest, or they saw something, or they heard something, or something ran across the road, or something peeked in through a window, or they found big footprints or something.
Yeah.
And they're looking at this from a very scientific point of view. And I think it's important from my research is science is very important. It's how we judge everything in our life. You know, whether it's from the tires on your car to your refrigerator, everything is science and math. And I think when we get into biology and studying animals, I think, or humans, because these things are very close to humans, I think Bigfoot's a lot closer to human than animals, actually. And I think from some of your descriptions, you might agree with that, versus 15, 20 years ago, the consensus is that these were very ape-like creatures. And from what I can tell, they're very human-like creatures, you know?
We're in a very interesting time period with a lot of this kind of stuff. 15, 20 years ago, I mean, a lot of knowledge that your average Joe is able to get is going to be like, let's say you watch your Unsolved Mystery series or your In Search Of series, or you go to the library and you find a book by John Green, Dr. John Bindernagel, Renee DeHenden, or
the classics.
Book, and you kind of read people's research, and you have a handful of information here, and a lot of eyewitness accounts you hear of are usually summarized in text or through interview, whether it's a soundbite, if you're listening to a radio show, or a newscast or something like that, or even a show like Unsolved Mysteries or In Search Of. You're usually getting a summarized and very dramatized version of this.
Also
encounter.
Editorialized is a good way to put it.
Exactly. And point being is, the amount of information people had access to 15, 20 years ago were only stemmed from few and far. Like, you really had to look for your opportunities to learn about this stuff. And
right.
And, we've had conversations about, about organizations that won't even accept Sasquatch encounters, or the idea of certain encounters, unless the descriptions fit a specific narrative that they're used to coinciding with.
Exactly.
So, but nowadays, in this day and age, where you have your Sasquatch Chronicles, where you have your Mattsquatch Presents, where you have an ocean full of YouTube channels and podcasts that allow witnesses to share these stories long form. And not only that, they don't really have that cutoff line. Like, once you start getting into this area that we're just unfamiliar with, or I should say uncomfortable with, then we're just like, instead of turn a blind eye, it's up to the public. The information's out there. And then suddenly now everybody's going, wait, hold on a second. Why is it all these people are suddenly talking about these creatures being gray, or these creatures crawling like spiders, or a number of other things that you hear about now?
Having language.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that we're just 15, 20 years ago to now, and the thing is, you still hear these descriptions of these things looking very ape-like too, and that very much could be perception.
You do.
It very much could be perception, or it could be that these creatures are just as diverse looking as we are.
Well, one thing on that just kind of popped into my mind really quick. Are you familiar with the Siege of Honabi?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Mike, the main guy on there, and I've heard this from other encounters where there were multiple Sasquatch, a clan, a family group, a gang, whatever you want to call these beings whenever they're together, a family. And I've heard this from multiple encounters, but Mike from the Siege of Honabi was very specific about this, that he had a bunch of them on his property. For people who don't know, it was a rural property for very, very short version of it. He had a property, family property, and these things were peeking into windows, killing his chickens, harassing him, trying to call him outside, bunch of creepy Bigfoot stuff. And it was very interesting getting to the descriptions, because that's kind of what we're focusing on the show here, is he describes some as looking very, he had a family group. Now, we're not talking like some of the work I've done on my channel, where the ones in the Pacific Northwest look very different than the ones in the desert of, say, Arizona or East Texas, look very different from the ones in Florida, look very different from the ones from Maine. We're not talking about that. Which was interesting is that he described ones looking very human-like, very big, and then he described ones looking a lot more gorilla, ape-like more like a King Kong, you know, like the Kong Skull Island that came out a few years ago. Up until that point, Kong was always portrayed as a quadruped, like a gorilla, and that one was fascinating to me. That, and I also love monster movies. What was fascinating is they portrayed him as standing upright, straight-backed, like a Bigfoot. When I saw that, I'm like, God damn, that looks like a Bigfoot, because it was the Kong gorilla with almost kind of like a beard growing, but very buff, like hairy bodybuilder. And I'm like, wow, they made him look like a Bigfoot. So anyway, the Sijunabi was very interesting. Is he described ones that looked very kind of Neanderthalish, kind of what you think of, other ones that looked very Patterson-Gimlin-like. And then he described other ones that looked very, very gorilla-like, very primitive looking, very ape-like. And interestingly enough, he described those, or that particular one, I think in part of his story, as being the more aggressive one. And I've heard this from some of Duke Sullivan's work, World Bigfoot Radio, some of his guests that he's had on. And I've heard this from numerous places where there'll be 2 or 3 of them, a group of them will surround people, or people will have continuing contact. And there will be the more human looking ones that are the more curious, looking in windows, the manipulation of objects, and the more primitive looking ones being the more aggressive ones, the ones charging and growling more. And I think that's very interesting, because we're not talking about 2 subspecies, so to speak. We're not talking about wolves and coyotes. We're talking about the same species here, or at least we think. Or if it's 2 different types in the same family group, or just, you know, some got the good genes and some got the bad genes, or, you know, one's older from a different clan and the other one's inbred. I mean, you don't know. There could be all sorts of ins and outs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I you know, that's one of the things in my research that's changed in the last 2 or 3 years. It's one of the things that put me on the map. Is I did videos, I did multiple conferences where I did my 10 types of Sasquatch, and it really holds up still to the different physical appearances with the things I would edit, like the 2020 edition of it, almost 2021. That's kind of scary. Almost the 2021 version of what I would do the 10 types of Sasquatch. Is I had them generally broken up into region. Hey, the ones in the Pacific Northwest generally look like this. The ones in the South generally look like this. And I always said generally, because I knew there was a lot of crossover. But from what I've heard, the ones I would call like a type 4 that were seen in the Northeast, Maine, New York area, New England area, you know, is very similar to what people describe here in the Arrowhead area, like the Claudia Ackley case we were talking about. And 2 or 3 years ago, I would have gone preposterous, you know, but now it's like, wow, there seems to be a really big divergent in how these things look. But then again, if you look at human beings, you know, an Inuit Eskimo looks a lot different than a sub-Sahara African, looks a lot different than somebody native from China, looks a lot different from somebody who's Norwegian. And we have, you know, quite a bit of difference in us as human beings. So I guess it kind of makes sense that there could be a difference in description. And this is without going into, you know, like what me and you were talking about the other day, that a 14-year-old's description, they say it looks like an ape, or they say it looks like a monkey. But to a lot of people, a monkey is a chimpanzee, and a chimpanzee technically is not a monkey. It's an ape, you know? So a lot of that terminology and how people describe it, or I think when a lot of people see Sasquatch, their mind instantly goes for the closest thing that they can think of. And I think a lot of times, darker hair, dark skin, hairy, living in the woods, no clothing, maybe a hunched over appearance, I think they instantly go for a gorilla or a chimpanzee or a bonobo. When you start breaking down like you do, the more facial features, having a more hooded nose like a human versus an ape nose, the placement of the ears, the eyes. What I always found, and one of the things I always do to try to debunk pictures, is the human proportions, like especially the space between the nose and the top of the lip is very broad on what we consider genuine Sasquatch pictures. Patterson-Gimlin, the whiteface, Bigfoot, some other ones that are very verifiable as being a Sasquatch photo. The proportions, having that mouth, like you said, that went right to the corners, having a very big space between the upper lip and the nose, the eyes, where you could put a person in makeup and you could make all sorts of stuff in makeup, but you can't move a nose or eyes or mouth. Those are always going to be where they're going to be. And also the physical proportions of like arm length, where the arm length and elbow is. Yeah, they could have much longer arms, and a human can have arm extensions, but you can't change where the elbow is or where the hips are and knees are. And that's one of the best ways to debunk somebody in a suit is, well, could a person physically fit those dimensions? Even a really big person or a really short person or a person on stilts or a person with arm extensions. And then you start looking where knees and things are, and you're like, hey, this doesn't line up. So, and what that has kind of showed us, I know Thinker Thunker and a lot of other people have done research into the physical proportions, which I think is important, is that they are somewhere between human. The proportions don't line up with human, but they're a lot closer to us than like a chimpanzee or a gorilla. And it's actually somewhere right in the middle. If you take a gorilla, stand him upright, and compare it to Patterson-Gimlin, and then compare that to like a human, a human's here, the gorilla's here, the Sasquatch is kind of almost right in the middle, and it's very fascinating,
Yeah.
And and you look back to a lot of the Native American stories that talked about how they would kidnap women to procreate with, and whether or not they're close enough to hybridize or divergent evolution. Some groups just are a little bit more human-like from those adaptations and have less fur and lighter skin, or slightly built. Are you familiar with Bergman's rule?
No, I don't believe so.
Bergman's rule is, and it's more of a guideline than a rule, but it's an idea in biology that the further north you go, the colder the climates, the bigger animals get.
Okay.
Like if you take a mule deer or a mountain lion from New Mexico, although they do get pretty big there, but say you take like a mountain lion from Mexico or even Central America. They have them there, but they're small. They're 70, 80 pounds. Versus a mountain lion from Alaska can be 250 pounds. The same thing with a black bear in southern states. A black bear in Arizona, Texas, 300-400 pounds is a big bear. But you go to Canada, and a black bear can be 700-800 pounds. There's this rule that the colder it gets and the higher latitudes you get to, the bigger the critter you get. That's why up north there's polar bears and the big grizzly bears and everything else, and the really big caribou, and the pictures of the massive 250-pound gray wolves. And because the higher you go up, generally the critters get bigger. And this is true with fish and birds and everything else. Not always, there are exceptions. And we seem to see that with Sasquatch, where in the South and the deep South, where they have the wood boogers, or the boogeyman as they call them, they describe him as being 7-8 feet tall, 8.5 feet tall.
Yeah.
Still huge, But then when you get into Canada and up north, you get stories of them 10, 11, 12 feet tall, like truly hugely monstrous.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes along with Bergman's rule, and if you're
Interesting.
living in the hot swamps and in thick bushes, and it's really hot out, and there's all sorts of vegetation and mold and everything else to deal with, and alligators and snakes, you might physically might lend itself to being a smaller creature versus wide open in the north, and the with all the cold and the snow, and the bigger the animals, you got to be bigger to kill the animals, kind of thing. So so when it comes to the physical descriptions of Bigfoot, like you were saying though, and you really hit the nail on the head, even 15 years ago, if I was standing in line at the, at the DMV or something like that, my phone made a phone call and maybe text. Now I can look up anything you ever wanted to know about Bigfoot from anywhere, as long as you have
Yeah.
cell phone service
Could
or Wi-Fi.
spend all day, every day doing it now.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've talked to lots and lots of people who, they have my videos on in the background, or you have Sasquatch Chronicles, and he's at, I don't know, 600-700 episodes now or something. And each episode's an hour and a half, couple hours long, and he puts a couple out a week. So you could literally, like, if you have a job in a factory where you're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again, or you're doing data entry, or you're just in front of a computer, or you're washing cars, I don't know, whatever you do for a living, that very much lends itself to put on a headset and just listen all day long. That's what I did for many years before I started my YouTube channel. I worked graveyard shifts where I was by myself. I had an entire campus of hospital or office buildings, depending on where I worked. I had all this stuff to do, and it was just walking around checking equipment, lots of time by myself and lots of downtime. So I could listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos, and it was the best education in the world. I think way better than, the books by all the PhD doctors and all the so-called experts and everything out there. And I do think that's part of the reason why.
I have a theory about that too.
Yeah. And real quick, I think when you look back historically, up until the 1950s, the Native Americans, settlers, everybody, we'll just concentrate on North America, described them as wild man or wild people, or the Native Americans described them as a tribe of people, or they're definite, the hairy people of the woods, from the Pacific Northwest, the Zuniqua, from the Kwakwak-Ewok tribe, the wild woman of the woods. And most tribes describe them as a tribe of people. Settlers described them as wild men of the woods. And it wasn't until the 50s and 60s when we really started to hear this, they're an ape, and the North American ape, or the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, and all these different names. And it was the modern scientific coming out of people like John Green, Renee DeHinden, all the classic people, where they said this is some kind of an ape. And even up until a couple of years ago, if you went to a big name Bigfoot conference, like I remember when I saw Cliff Brackman a few years ago in 2017 at the International Bigfoot Conference, the first thing he did when he came out on stage, everybody knows Cliff Brackman, big name, nice guy. And he said, first off, Bigfoot is an animal, not a person. And it was very much, he said it with a lot of certainty. And he had a lot of good scientific stuff, because he, did hand cast and foot cast, and did hand positioning compared to like an ape and compared to a human. And he had a lot of scientific stuff, but to definitively say that they're a human, they're an ape, not a human, was very interesting. And that was been kind of the scientific consensus up until very recently. Though there's a lot of mainstream or big time or small time like me, Bigfoot researchers, who are really starting to go back the other way, starting to consider these things more human. And I've done videos on this, and when you look at their documented language usage, their tool usage, their interactions, the way that they can manipulate their environment, the way that they can express emotion and bury their dead, and you start to get into well, then what do you classify as human? Do you consider, the way that they can braid and actually make things? It's like you can say that you're human when you can make art. Well, there's stories of them doing that. Using language, there's stories of them doing that. Burying their dead, there's stories of them doing that. So at what point do you start considering these things to be a lot more human? Not necessarily human like me and you, but a lot closer to it than an ape.
To take it to a much darker place, you hear stories. I don't know if you've talked to people firsthand, but there are stories of people who work in military, in the armed forces and stuff like that, who have stories of them confronting these
crazy stories
and killing them and oftentimes being ordered to shoot and kill these things, or being recruited into, in a very roundabout way, to kind of go off looking for these things. But you know, a lot of the trauma these people face after the fact is because they say things like, this thing was screaming and crying just as if just as we would if somebody was about to shoot us. Like it was looking at me and it was screaming and crying for its life. Not like an animal, it was screaming like a woman. It was screaming and crying for its life. Like that always, you know, that always resonates with me when you say stuff like that about, you know, about things that kind of humanize. Again, perception is our biggest ally and our biggest enemy within the whole Bigfoot community, because it's through people's perceptions and through people's perspectives and through people's encounters that we learn about all this stuff. Like you mentioned before, you know, you probably could learn 10 times more out of having headphones plugged in and, like the Matrix, just having constant information inputted into your head versus reading, you know, one of the professionals' books. So, and I think a good reason for that is with a lot of the books, unless you're somebody who's had an encounter themselves or somebody who's already prone to believe this stuff, if you're not a believer, if you're somebody who just like wants nothing to do with this, chances are it's going to take more than a book to really convince you, you know.
It's gonna have to. It's gonna have to run up and slap you.
Yeah. And either that, or you really have to slowly be eased into these waters. And when
Right.
and a lot of times when you read a lot of people's stuff and you hear theories, and then once you get into the tribal nature, ritualistic things that seem a little bit more human, that's where people think, that's where the eye rolling kind of starts, and then they're just kind of cut off at that point. Versus if they constantly have this in their head, then they're allowing a long series of time. They're committing a lot of time to sitting there, listening and retaining not information that they're looking at. They're not reading these words and processing this information. They're listening to somebody's voice, oftentimes with shitty quality, and it doesn't sound like this beautifully produced thing. So these people just don't feel like they're being, you know, BS'd around. So, and with that, you get all the nuances of the story. You get all the nuances, and then suddenly these people who are listening, who've spent now not just an hour or a few hours or a couple days reading a book, but now have spent a few months or now a year of a good few days a week really obtaining all this information. Not only are they hearing common threads within descriptions and within all this, but they're now they're now recognizing reoccurring patterns within behaviors, within the way people deal with trauma, within certain things, you know. So yeah, you're right. I think, again, because of this day and age and because of the amount of information there is out there, I think it's a better time than ever for people who have never been into this to really truly get into this and have the information, you know, that they would need to at least get them hooked. You know, once somebody's interested and once they start digging into this for themselves, you know, chances are they're hooked.
Well, yeah, and kind of like you were saying, I think encounter stories are so important. They're so important because when you listen to Sasquatch Chronicles, or, you know, occasionally I cover an encounter on my channel, although that's not primarily what I do. And you just listen to somebody's story, whether it's just, you know, a neighbor or another hunter or an uncle, somebody who's telling you a Bigfoot story. What's important is these people aren't into this subject. They don't have any vested interest in it. For the most part, you do get people who have an interest in it, and, you know, sometimes they get what they're looking for. But 95% of the time, it's all just kind of normal people who witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be there. So the way they describe it is, like I was saying earlier, it's uneditorialized. They're going off their emotion and what they saw. So you're getting a description of what they saw and how it made them feel. This thing was 10 feet tall, hairy, and gave me a look like it was going to kill me, and the hair stood up on my neck, and I felt like I was going to die. You know, someone gives you a description like that, you're like, okay, you know, that paints a very big picture in your mind of a forest with a very dark, big, hairy looking creature giving you, you know, death stare kind of a thing. And this isn't an expert. This isn't somebody saying, well, I think, you know, this was a territorial thing, or you must have been near its young, or you interrupted its hunt. I mean, what's great about these encounter stories is it lets you draw the picture. It's kind of like the other day I was reading, because I read all kinds of crap that's usually pretty useless. I was reading an article about bear attacks, and it had the summary, it had all the statistics. 97% of bear attacks involving a person defending themselves with a handgun were successful. And, you know, versus pepper spray can be 85 to 90%, and incidences where they had both. And you start going through the statistics of a bear attack, and you think, bear attack, cool, exciting, I want to hear about it. But when you start hearing the statistics, the eyes roll back in the back of your head. And you start looking at the facts, and you're like, well, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but you lose it really quick. Well, then the article actually had 45 different bear attacks listed on there, and you could spend 2 or 3 hours reading them all. And to me, that was fascinating. So it's like, do you want just the facts? Do you want the boring stuff? Do you want the numbers? Do you want a summary? Or would you rather hear all the stories and come to your own conclusion? And I think that's what the core of all the internet, people being able to share it in their own words, uneditorialized, not some organization where a guy comes out and interviews you, then writes up what he thinks you meant and puts an interpretation, or leaves some things out, or adds something in there, or because you didn't say something, assumes something and puts it into the story. So I think that's what's very powerful, is you're getting all the facts. You're not getting the synopsis. So it lets you paint a picture of Bigfoot encounters on the road seem to generally go like this. Bigfoot encounters in the Pacific Northwest seem to generally be like this. People who have them around their house, generally you start seeing these patterns, and you're not necessarily, you know, you can, and I have notes on my phone and notepads where I'm writing things down and descriptions and all that other kind of stuff, but I'm kind of a dork about it. But even just casually, you start to see a pattern in this stuff. And human brains, we like to organize things, we like to put things in patterns, we like to classify things. And that's what I noticed when years ago, when Sasquatch Chronicles first came out and other shows were just doing just encounters, is you start to paint a picture in your mind, you start to catalog, kind of like you read a good book and you're painting a whole world in your head of what it would look like. And then you start hearing stories that are painting very similar pictures, very much descriptions. And then you get outliers that aren't anything like any of the other stories. Now, those are the real fascinating ones. Yeah, and it's quite fascinating when, and that's kind of the thing. And even Wes Germer from Sasquatch Chronicles, he's, oh, there goes the iPad. Got it. The Wes Germer is very good about it, because he always asks the question, even if they forget to leave it out, what did the face look like? Because that's what everybody wants to know. What did the face look like? What did the eyes look like? How big was the mouth? For me, going from it from a I call myself semi-scientific about this, what did the teeth look like? Dentition is very important on food source. What food sources are in the air? What did the teeth look like, and what area was it in? You know, did it have very flat teeth? Did you live in a very lush environment where there would be lots of organic food sources besides meat? Or was this like in the wild tundra where the only food source is you're going to have to go run down a caribou, you know, because there's literally nothing else to eat but meat, you know? So there's little things like that are always very fascinating. And I'm sure you're going to elaborate here, and I can't wait to hear. What have you found from people's descriptions?
Well, you said something very interesting that kind of touches into that. You mentioned that how people like to categorize things, right? People like to kind of categorize things and kind of understand and place them in ways that they understand. It's human nature, you know. That's just what we do. see something and it's categorized. We see somebody, the way somebody's dressed, and you know, two people will see that same person and think two completely different things. I've worked with people. I've worked with a witness, and the witness I worked with, when she had her sighting, she was with her friend, and she had to drink herself to sleep that night. She was so horrified by what had happened. It really did a number on her. Her friend, on the other hand, had a little bit of experience within this world. You know, I think she, you know, had heard stories from family and all that. So she was more prepared, I guess, than she was. But her friend later on, after the fact, when they were camping, found it funny. So you have one person who's drinking themselves to sleep, who has to drink themselves to sleep, and you have another person who kind of finds it funny, you know, the whole situation. And that's because you have somebody who went into this whole situation completely blind, no ideas, no this, no that. And then you had another person who was, at the very least, had some information, whether she believed it or not, from family members, from whatever. So after the fact, when one of them was like, oh my God, the world is not what it seems at all. We are in this weird Matrix, you know, Harry Potter-like world. I just saw a monster. And then you have another person going, holy hell, Grandpa was right. Grandpa, crazy Grandpa, his stories were right. Like that is, you know, and so perception, the biggest, my biggest take out of what I do, as far as being an eyewitness sketch artist for people who have seen Bigfoot, is it's a masterclass on perception. Because you have one person see this creature and think, oh my God, it's a Neanderthal. Another person say, oh my God, it's an ape. And you have another person that'll say, oh my God, that was a Nephilim, because this person had spent every Sunday in Sunday school, and they've had, you know, they've read every version of the Bible that they've ever gotten their hands on and whatnot. So it fits a narrative that they kind of understand, and they're able to kind of categorize as such. So it must be, you know, you have anybody within their encounters, it only goes you can only go so far before you start messing with perception. The whole thing is perception. The whole thing is people's perception. But again, at a certain point, when they're describing it to you, when they're describing the way the eyes look, when they're describing the way the mouth looks, even eyes, let's say a description here often is big, wide, offset, almond-shaped eyes. You hear that a lot. Big,
I hear that all the time.
Shaped eyes, right? I bet you if you got three people and you said, three of you, draw pictures of big, wide, offset, almond-shaped eyes, I bet you those three pictures would look pretty different from each other, just from that description. You know, when you say a wide mouth, I'm telling every person I work with, when they say wide mouth, the mouth, the descriptions of the mouth are the same when they start to describe it, but once you get into it, my approach into the eyewitness sketch stuff is incredibly analytical. And so once we really start getting into those specifics and it starts to shape out, the mouths have their own, there is somewhat of a uniformed look to it, but they all have their own unique shape, their own unique, you know, looks, just as all of our mouths, you know. So yeah, once you take an approach that kind of cuts through a lot of the emotion, a lot of that perception, and just takes this very analytical approach, you kind of get to this one place. It's always very interesting. But getting there is always interesting too, because it's always this dance of perception. This is probably a great way to enter into the Claudia Ackley story. The last video, if you haven't seen it, we talked about the Claudia Ackley encounter, which was the you know, the more well-known encounter that's taken place in the Lake Arrowhead, BigBear area. We talked about that. We talked about me doing an eyewitness sketch with Claudia, as well as her youngest daughter who was there during that encounter. I went into that whole thing in that video, so check it out. So what I was going to tell you was something that was very interesting is that the younger daughter, Claudia's daughter, at one point in time, the brow ridge, I think I remember telling you that she kept grilling me on the brow ridge. There was a very specific fold or something on the brow ridge, and I was just trying really hard to get it. We were going through all this reference and all that, and you know, and we really didn't. I feel like she left me off the hook and was like, yeah, that's good enough, you know, but I didn't feel confident with it. Well, the next day when I did the witness sketch with Claudia, she was starting to describe the forehead of the creature, right? And the way Claudia was describing it, suddenly, instantly, I got it. I was like, oh my God, I know exactly what they're talking about. But the thing is, if I was just talking to Claudia and just got her description, I wouldn't have known. It seriously took the daughter's description of what she was talking about and Claudia's description together to make it click, you know. And Claudia is also having a hard time describing to me this forehead. It's very tough for her too. But the areas she's describing were the areas that kind of, you know, she was kind of lacking a little bit. So there was like balance in the two, I guess. But here's the tricky part of what I do. I can't apply what the daughter said into Claudia's sketch, you know.
Right.
That all knowledge, even of past Sasquatch sketches, all that stuff, it has to be a clean slate. It has to be from the perspective of the person. Otherwise, I'm just drawing a picture of Sasquatch using my Rolodex of eyes, ears, noses that I want to see, you know. So, and the same thing with Claudia, you know, I don't want to start seeping in her daughter's descriptions, you know, feeding me into what she was seeing, even though at this point we were drawing the same creature. And I'm really glad that didn't happen, because as I told you before, as it turned out, there was so many inconsistencies within their drawings. I could touch on that because I didn't get to elaborate on that much.
Sure. Yeah.
The inconsistencies going into this whole deal, when I talked to both Claudia and her daughter, I talked to them separately. I talked to Claudia's daughter first. I covered this way more elaborately in the last video, but we sat down, we talked for over 2 hours, and then we drew for another 2 hours, sat down and did the witness sketch for another 2 hours. She remembered tons, got a lot of incredible information out of that. But one thing, I actually wrote down a couple of these things here. So right off the bat, Claudia has always said it looked like a giant Neanderthal man. It didn't
That's
look
exactly how she described it to me.
Okay, she said didn't look like an ape.
Exactly.
And Claudia's daughter said, and this is her the day of the encounter, there was 2 daughters with her. She had her youngest daughter and then her older daughter. I met her younger daughter. So in the video, in Claudia's video, she's the one saying, I want to go home now. You hear, I want to go home now.
Right.
I want to go home now. Well, she had said that it looked like an ape. She goes, it looked like a giant ape. It was like a gorilla, a big gorilla. And I said, okay, you know, and she knows that her mom has described it as a Neanderthal, you know, but she's like, no, it didn't look, there was nothing human about this. It looked like a gorilla. It's like,
this is fascinating to hear.
Yeah,
both
so
two
like,
completely different.
Well, there, you know, hey, you know, that could be something, or it could be something. Another thing was, and I know I mentioned this before, was the hairstyle, the hairstyle, like they have style, you know, but the hair on the top of its head. So the daughter had said that the hair was going straight up like a treasure troll. She said that it went up to a point that she could tell the head wasn't pointy. She could tell the head wasn't pointy. It had a rounded head. She said that the hair was up, but it was up unnaturally. She said it looked like it would push its hair up all over its head, like up like this. She didn't see it do this. She just said it just looked like that's what it would do. As I was drawing and I was kind of saying, so up like this, she would like hover over me going, no, 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 like up, like even behind the ears. And I just gave her the pencil. I go, show me. And so she got the pencil and she's like behind the ear. She's like up like this, like up, like, you know, getting really into it. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So really like, and then she said like a treasure troll. Like it was exactly like a treasure troll. I was like, okay, that was very specific.
Just every bit of hair, just straight up.
Straight up, you know. And that was one of the, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It just kind of makes me wonder, like, yeah, like obviously they don't have barbers or anything. So to keep the hair out of its eyes and out of what it's eating and everything, just, I'm sure they don't take baths very often either. So just the muck and grease and everything else, they probably just, they probably just push their hair up and push it out of the way, you know? And, you know, like with hairstyles, if you're one of those people that slicks your hair back all the time, after years, it starts kind of growing that way, you know? So maybe just from years of pushing the hair out of the way, kind of had, you know, the Marge Simpson troll hair going on.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Or some kind of
very interesting.
A nervous tick, or, you know, who knows?
Whatever, yeah.
So, you know, she was very adamant about that. The things that really stood out to her were the eyes and the hair. And I should mention that the daughter, before Claudia, only saw the creature in the tree, which she described as a giant alpha male. And the daughter, she saw that same creature, but before then, there was two other creatures that ran right in front of her, crossed her path, ran down a hill behind a tree, and when she looked up the tree, there was the big alpha male. That's when her mom ran up in front of them and only saw the alpha male. So before she saw this male at kind of a distance, right in front of her was this smaller one, two of them. And she said it looked right into her eyes. She just said it opened her eyes, looked right into her eyes. So she was very fixated on these eyes. You talk to Claudia, she also talks about the eyes as well too, but she talks a lot about the ears, you know, the big Dumbo ears. Got a big Dumbo ears, and it had, you know, these big almond-shaped eyes, black, just black, and so, you know, the younger daughter that I worked with saw more than just the alpha male. I should mention that. So the skin, Claudia described the skin being gray. And gray, and she said she could see the texture. It was like a skin, like a thick skin texture, but it was like gray. Whereas all over its cheek, face, ear, everything, it was gray. The daughter said that it had peach fuzz all over its face. Peach fuzz all over its face, all over its ears. And they said that, you know, Claudia was very specific about the hairline. The hairline before it went up to the hair on top of the head, she was very specific about the shape of how that hairline was and how the hair was in that area, you know. The daughter said that there was no hairline, that the peach fuzz, this naturally went into the hair that went up at, like the treasure troll that she described.
Oh, okay.
So again, ape Neanderthal, the skin was inconsistent. And then Claudia, when I was doing the drawing with Claudia was not around when I did the drawing with the daughter. So she didn't see the end result. We weren't going to show the results of what happened to each other until both were done, so we could kind of compare all that jazz. So,
but you didn't want to contaminate their mental image by showing them something else. So
correct. So Claudia, when it came down to the hair, and I was, you know, asking her about the hair on the top of its head, I said, all right, let's talk about the hair on top of its head. Was there anything distinct about that? And she said, it was messy and all over the place. And I said, okay, so messy as in how? Like, be a little bit more specific as in messy, you know? And so she just said, it just looked like, you know, like it, you know, was just out and everywhere. I go, all right. And again, you don't want to lead the witnesses at all by saying, was it messy going in any specific direction? You know, you don't
Right.
want to, nothing, there's nothing like that. So you just, let's find some reference. Like, you know, if you know, is it messy like a person's messy hair, like a dog's messy hair, like an animal's messy hair? And let's find some reference. Like, let's, you know, what kind of messy, the texture we talk, and we get all down dirty into the descriptions. And the more that we do this, the further and further away from treasure trolls she's getting. In fact, you know, it seems like that would be the first thing she would say. It's a treasure troll. If you saw somebody with a treasure troll hairdo, it's like treasure troll. So the skin, inconsistency, the hair on top of its head, inconsistency, ape, Neanderthal, inconsistency. So I think that was those that I think from what I can remember, those were the inconsistencies that really stuck out with me, and they're big ones. So
Right. Well, and there's one thing that was just kind of occurred to me is if you look at a chimpanzee or a gorilla or an ape and you look at a human, obviously they're very different. But if you think about it, we got all the same stuff: hair on our head, a nose, 2 eyes, 2 ears, teeth, lips, cheeks, a neck, trapezoid muscles on our shoulders. You know, even though their mouth protrudes a bit more and everything else, it's kind of one of those things where there is a big difference, but it's also kind of, you know, you share what, like 90% or 98% of your DNA with a chimpanzee. It's also kind of like, as different as they are, it's also amazing that, you know, we're really talking about details here, because when you think, you know, an eye, a nose, a mouth in the same locations, same spots, generally in the range of human for ears and everything else. Yeah, it's just, you know, from an overall big picture, from a morphology, they have a lot of similarity, but the placement and everything else and how they use them could be different, you know?
yeah. Well, we cover extensively on the last video the cloud of, you know, of craziness that covers this whole account with, you know, people who are associated, beating all that stuff. We've talked about all that, you know. So between that kind of stuff and between the inconsistencies that I just pointed out, that's more than enough for people to put their hands up and go, all right,
yeah, there isn't anything here,
folks,
yeah.
and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, here's the twist at the end of the story. Here's the twist at the end of the story, kids. Circled around the campfire. So at a certain point, I was talking with the younger daughter about the creature, and we're talking about the description, and at the beginning we both agreed to do a witness sketch of the alpha male that was, you know, the one that Claudia described as an alpha male on the tree, because that was the creature that both of them saw. And so, you know, I was doing that, but while I was drawing with the daughter, I mean, I did a whole full sketch with her, right? A whole full sketch that looked a lot like
full body sketch.
Like face into like the shoulder, like this area here, you know,
a bust, a profile, a portrait. Yeah.
Of one description, right? And she kept talking about it, but when she kept talking about it, she kept referencing the smaller one that crossed in front of her and looked at her in her face, right? And so at a certain point, I stopped. I go, hold on. I asked her. I said, the fuzzy face, was that on the one on the tree, or was that on the one that ran in front of you? She goes, the one that ran in front of me. I go, well, what about the one in the tree? Did it also have a fuzzy face? She goes, oh, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't think so. And I go, oh, okay, interesting. And say so she started to get cross references of all that. Like
They were starting to bleed
they
over.
were starting to bleed over, and the reason being is I went into this whole experience being, drawing, these creatures for Claudia and her daughter. I went into this whole deal knowing Claudia's story incredibly well. And the creature of that story was this creature in the tree, this dark subject in this video, this quick Snapchat video that her older daughter got. That's the creature
Right.
of this encounter. That's what I'm going down to draw. I can't wait to see this. And between the two people, I should get a pretty good look at what this looks like. But the monkey wrench thrown in the machine was that wasn't the primary creature of the daughter's encounter. The creature of her encounter was the one that was about 12 feet away from her and looked into her soul. That's the one she couldn't get out of her head. So when I went down behind the mountain and then she saw the big one up there, she was already worried, like, oh my God, there's tons of these things everywhere, and they're
everywhere,
and they're gonna attack us. So with her, I think Claudia wanted to get that image of her creature out of her head really bad. And the daughter wanted to get the image of this creature out of her head really bad. So at that point, I just said, hey, do you want to draw that creature? Let's scrap this and just draw that creature. And she was like, yes. And man, it was, it looks similar, but what the first one was a clear hybrid of what Claudia had and what we ended up with, So, and as far as when I was drawing that next day with Claudia, cutting back to the hair talk, right? Claudia saying it's messy everywhere and all that. So I'm showing her the picture. I'm showing her, and she looks at it and she said, yeah, but the hair was a little bit thicker on the top. I said, all right. So I started to thicken it up a bit. And she goes, yeah, it was thicker, but it was more up, like it was going up. And I was like, oh, all right. So I started, drawing it up more. And she goes, yeah. And where the hairline is here, circular here, like the hair was kind of coming up, like in these like little S things, like up, coming up here, like up in here. I go, all right, I'm drawing. She goes, and then the sides was kind of like pushed. She goes, like hat head. It looked like it had hat head, like it had been wearing a hat, and it was like pushed on the sides here, right? It was like pushed on the side. So I'm drawing this, right? She took a different route, and I'm drawing it, and it's looking more and more like her daughter's. And then finally, Claudia goes, Don King. It looked like Don King. It had Don King's hair. It had hair like Don King.
Yeah.
And then I was like, all right. So, and I started drawing. I go kind of like this. She goes, yes. And when she settled on it is when it looked like, what Jenna had described. And for the record, Jenna, for the creature that we ended up, drawing with the creature of her, encounter, the younger one, the hair did not look like that at all. That was something very specific to the big creature. The other creature's hair was not like that at all.
Okay, so I've got a question I've always had about this encounter. And I remember thinking about it at the time. Well, I mean, I've talked to Claudia a few times about this, but one thing that occurred to me and occurring to me now is she described it multiple times very distinctly as the big ugly alpha male, more or less. Mm-hmm. It was the one in charge. It was the big one. And she kept saying alpha male. It was a boy. It was a male. He was in charge. He was the daddy, however you want to describe it. She kept saying that, but she never gave me any reason to why she drew that conclusion. And I was wondering if you had any insight into that. I mean, other than it, the face looking male with being kind of hairy and ugly. And I mean, but how do you know it's the alpha male and not an older brother or whatever? Just to keep saying alpha male. I mean, obviously it presented a image or a aura or air of authority or badassness or toughness or sinisterness that made it seem like that guy up there, he's in charge, don't mess with him. And he very much well been so, but she never really elaborated to me. She kept saying it was an alpha male. He was the big ugly guy. He was the one in charge. And I'm like, okay. And I kind of let her go, but I didn't really press her on why she thought that.
I did.
And it was always kind of
yeah, I did press her. I asked her straight up. I said, did anyone see a Bigfoot ding ding? You know,
the Bigfoot ding dong. Yeah.
The Bigfoot ding dong, you know, because it is seen quite a bit. And
oh yeah, they don't wear clothes. Quite a few people tell stories of this thing running across the road with it dangling, running as it runs by.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I mean, we won't go down that road. We'll stay off the ding ding road. But yeah, I asked her straight up, what did you see? Why did you think it was male? Like, tell me specifically what made you think that. And she said, I didn't see any private parts or anything like that because of the way it was positioned. It was a bit to the side.
It was kind of behind the tree.
It was behind the tree, and it was to the side, and its legs were bent this way, bent down. So it was a little bit of a squatting. So even then, but she did say, she said, I can see it. You hear people talk about how fit, you know, and like they had this physique and this like triangle
shaped,
you know, like this. She said this thing had a gut. She said she could see its gut just dangling down here above its, you know, on its thighs up here. She said I could see its gut, I could see its chest, I could see it, you know, it's all that. So she didn't see the one indicator that would guarantee that it was male, but I you know, it was just that same, you know, it was like, as you mentioned it must have been just the energy, the vibe of the whole thing and all that, that just gave her the distinct impression. But the daughter also had the impression that it was male too. And I asked her, I said, why do you think that? And she was just kind of like, I don't know. I don't know. Oh, it's what I just thought it was. Like I saw, it's what I thought it was.
It looked like a dude. So
yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know, and I've heard this from a lot of other encounters too. One that sticks out in my mind was a guy, I believe he was in Maine, and he was running through the woods, and he ran right into one. Like literally he was digging through the trees, and he like whack right into one. And he got up, he thought he ran into a tree. And he looks up, and he sees it kind of from the back, kind of like a shoulder going away view. And he's laying there on the ground trying to figure out, and the only thing that popped into his mind was it was female, because it wasn't V-shaped, it was barrel-chested. Some of the features just looked, even though it was 9-foot tall, giant hulking of a creature, it still was a little bit more gracile. And then he could see that it had more breast, and the features were a little bit softer. And he's like, what is this big, ugly, hairy woman thing that I ran into? But it was very interesting because he described it right away as trying to figure out, like, who is this really ugly, giant woman out in the woods, you know? And he instantly described it as a female, even from kind of a parting side shot after running flat into it and falling on his back. And this thing was very aggressive with him, but that's part of the other story. But yeah, he described it as just being, you know, kind of more barrel chested, you know, still huge, kind of a little more sloping shoulders, not so big and boxy and brawny, and the nose and the eyes and everything just had a lot more gracile appearance to it, without out and out like, are you a female or male kind of a thing. So it's kind of like from, you know, 100 yards away, if you're down at the park, you can tell somebody even wearing a hoodie. You can generally tell if it's a female or a male, you know, with you know, with like certain exceptions, you just kind of tell how people look.
Yeah. You know, drawing these creatures on my social media, I don't post a lot of witness sketch stuff. I don't usually post those unless the witnesses post them first, or unless there's permission to do so and all that stuff. And a lot of the ones to be honest, a lot of the sketches I have done, they have given me permission to post, but I'm just kind of waiting for them to post them first, you know, and that just hasn't happened. Anyways, point behind all this is a good chunk of the pictures that I post, I usually tag with not based on any particular encounter, because it's just me sitting around just drawing, going through my Rolodex of eyes, ears, nose, all the stuff that I can't do when I'm doing the eyewitness sketch stuff. When I'm doing the
And
eyewitness sketch
kind
stuff,
of like kind of like a composite creature, you
yeah,
know?
of something in my head versus something in someone else's head. It's the way I kind of get that out of my system. So when I do go to draw for someone else, I'm not, jonesing to create a Bigfoot here. I'm just letting them use what I do. But point being is, a good chunk of these pictures that I draw, some of them are specific, like this is a large male, this is a female, this is a juvenile, some of them are specific, some are just faces, just general
Right.
faces. And you be surprised, you get 50% will say, wow, she's this and this and this, and then you have another 50% that's like, he's this and this and this and this. People pick up different things. You have half people saying that it's a man, half people seeing a woman. And it all plays into the whole perception thing. Great segue into the final inconsistency with the Claudia daughter thing, because the three big inconsistencies were the hairstyle, the skin, and then the fact that Claudia was very adamant on that this would look like a Neanderthal man, and that the daughter was very adamant that it looked like a gorilla, like an ape. And so after all our sketches were said and done, me and Claudia are sitting at a table. I have the laptop open, and we're going through different artists' renderings, different renderings of Neanderthal men. And like digital illustrations, things of that sort, different types. And so she's looking through one, and she sees one, and in my opinion, looked more human than ape, but
Right.
and Claudia seemed to think the same thing, and it was a replica of a Neanderthal, or a hypothetical take on a Neanderthal. And behind us was Claudia's daughter on her phone, and she looks at what we're looking at, and she says, "You think that looks like a man?" And Claudia says, "Well, it's a Neanderthal." She goes, "You think that looks like a Neanderthal?" And Claudia's like, "Well, it is a Neanderthal." She goes, "No, it's not. It's an ape. That's an ape." And Claudia's going, "No, this is actually, no, look, it says right here, this is a Neanderthal thing. This is Neanderthal man. This, blah, 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 blah. They're going back and forth with each other like, that's an ape. No, that's an ape. Oh, whatever. And even those two in that moment did not get that inconsistently suddenly became consistent because of just perception, right? So
Right.
suddenly all these inconsistencies, all these things that, that would normally prevent people from taking this encounter seriously, once these people are given the adequate tools and outlet to really try to show what went down, suddenly all those inconsistencies became consistent again.
Right. Yeah. And just real quick, I wanted to hit on again what I talked about the other day, is that, remember, when you say it looked like a caveman or a Neanderthal, there are no living Neanderthals. We've never had one in a zoo. Even the infancy of photography, 150 years ago, we've never had one. No
So
one
it's
has
that
ever.
person's idea of a Neanderthal.
Yeah. And we're basing our idea of what a Neanderthal would look like is they take a skull, they do the forensic files things and put flesh on it, and then they give it a skin tone and they guess. And remember that even your concept of what a Neanderthal or a Cro-Magnon or an early human, all that is based on somebody else's perception of how they built that. They could have had it. They could have made it covered in hair and had purple skin. They could have done whatever they wanted. They could, and they even say in certain recreations that this is more of a robust version. This is more of a gracile version. And this is, well, we discovered it in Africa. It's like, well, why wouldn't it have dark skin? People native to Africa do, versus ones that are, from a higher latitude where it's generally colder and generally have paler skin. And there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of inconsistencies even in the recreation. So it's like you're basic. So you got to remember, someone says it looks like a Neanderthal, they're basing their opinion of what a Neanderthal looked like off somebody else's opinion,
And who knows which one?
Yeah,
because they've
exactly.
changed throughout the years as well too.
Exactly. And like that Neanderthal, even with some hair added to it and a darker skin tone or darker, lighter in certain areas, you could dress up to look a lot like a Bigfoot, because they're going to have the lot more robust skeleton and skull underneath. So it's just very interesting to me when people describe things, like what their perception, and that's when you kind of do as an investigator. I consider myself an investigator more than, I don't consider myself a Bigfoot expert. I don't consider myself, I consider myself an investigator, almost kind of like how a doctor is a practice, like practicing, investigating, always forming opinions, always, every day it's something new ideas. And that's one thing that you kind of have to, you don't want to fill in the blanks yourself, but you almost kind of need to take it with a grain of salt and assume that what they think of a Neanderthal is, if you Google Neanderthal and there's a picture of a lifelike recreation in a museum, I think everybody's seen that one where it looks like an old man with the gray hair and a gray beard, and he's got like a staff. Yeah, and he's all squinty eyed. He looks like a caveman Mel Brooks almost, and and if you look, that's like what you were saying exactly. That's quite a bit different than you would, from some of the old anthropology books from like what my mom had going back to the 60s and 70s. It's a very different look than they had even back then, And I think we've all heard the cliche of, if you took a Neanderthal and gave him a shave and a haircut and put him in a suit and walked down the street, you wouldn't recognize him. But then there's also other people that say, no, you would, they would stick out. You would know them instantly. So anyway, it's just kind of one of those things for perspective. It's like anybody can Google a picture of a gorilla. I go to the San Diego Zoo all the time. I've looked directly at a gorilla. I know what they look like. I can pull up a picture of it. Other than a skull and some recreations, we don't know what a Neanderthal looked like. We can have a guess. And it's just kind of interesting when people are basing their guess or their best description off of another guess.
Because
so I think that's kind of a factor. Or like 4 or 5 years ago, the Geico caveman commercial. People who aren't really into this stuff like me and you, they're going to superimpose that as what they think a Neanderthal looked like, is the Geico caveman. So they're going to superimpose that in their description of, well, it's somewhere between a caveman and it's somewhere between an ape. Okay, right. Where in that scale? And then, you go caveman here. Well, what about just regular human like me and you, and then ape over here? And, so it's just very interesting. And I've got a lot of respect for you because I'm very analytical and I take a lot of things with a grain of salt. You kind of have to in the paranormal world. You have to kind of get inferences and where people are describing. But when people say that they saw a dolphin when they're in the ocean, I expect it to be a dolphin and not really a sea lion.
Right.
That would drive me nuts that you do. Is like, if you tell me something, like I'm very much going to hold you to what you told me, and you better make sure you have your terminology right. And some family members, some people I know, they call things by the wrong name all the time, and it drives me nuts, and they don't care. But I'm like, I'm very much like, no. There's a difference from what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think especially in modern day, we say a lot of things we don't necessarily mean. without getting too political, there's a lot of slogans and a lot of things people say and have tattooed and written and throw out there. And I'm like, if you take what that literally means, that doesn't make sense, So I think when, you trying to dissect this stuff, I think that's where people need to realize is that it's somebody's interpretation, but it's also somebody's knowledge, kind of like one of the theories going back before the 1920s and 30s, they all described Bigfoots as wild men of the woods. Well, before the 20s and 30s, the average people didn't know what a monkey or a gorilla, I mean, maybe they'd seen a monkey, like a little monkey, like a Captain Jack monkey, but like an actual mountain gorilla or even a chimpanzee like to the average person wasn't really known. So maybe a human was the only thing they could describe it as.
Right.
Or maybe if they heard of a gorilla, they had no idea what it actually looked like, or they saw somebody sketch in a book,
Yeah.
that was somebody else's interpretation. So to me, I think that's what's fascinating is there's many layers of stuff to get through.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to hit, I think you're going to hit on this, but for me, whenever I watch the Forensic Files TV shows and they're doing a sketch or they have a lineup of 7 or 8 subjects and they go, that's it, that's the one. Or for me as, when you're looking at a native plant or an animal species or a bird, you can't identify what kind of bird is that, or a car or something like, what kind of car was that? And you see a picture and it clicks and you go, aha, that was it. And I think that's probably a pretty big moment for you where you see it in somebody's eyes like, oh my God, this is what I'm looking at.
I was just having this conversation with my wife recently. There's this transition. There's these like layers to a session, like a sketch session, where at first they're almost hesitant to kind of just overload you with information, but once they see the process and how specific we can get, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, there is a really good chance of me being able to see what I saw here. So then all of a sudden it goes from being hesitant to like them being almost aggressive. No, that's not it. Let's keep looking.
This is here.
It's
this
here.
Is here. There
it's
was
kind of
here.
It's this. I mean, we're using tons of references. It's a lot more visual stuff, a lot more visual reference that we work with before we get into the descriptive stuff. It takes a while before we even start talking like, now start doing this, it's a very long process. But anyways, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So one question that's just been popping into my mind here, I've been wanting to ask you, have you, because you've been doing this for a while and you've done this quite a bit, have you encountered anything like missing an eye or a scar or having a tooth knocked out or one ear like bitten off and the other one not, or some kind of, like a visual or a freckle or a mole or a wart, or is there any kind of something other than just, blank space? Have anybody ever described anything like that? Like it had a scar across it or it's missing an eye?
Not a ton, but the ones that stand out, they're not as cool as scars or anything like that. I hope to God that happens. Well, one, was like had this old man kind of hairline and this kind of Mr. Fuji kind of beard thing. And that was very interesting. Claudia's description of the ears was incredibly interesting because she was very specific about the earlobes, how the earlobes looked, and the relation, the shape to when it connected to the rest of the ears here. So that was cool. I got an airplane going over me here. Hold on one second. I'm not sure if you can hear that. But the one that was kind of cool was I did a witness sketch for the host of a podcast called Bigfoot's Wilderness. And
I've heard of them.
Yeah, I did the witness sketch for the host, and in his encounter, it had a patch of like, I have to think, I wish I had the picture on me. It was, I think, a dark color, but then it had like these very specific marks of honey brown hair patterns. like this shoulder had a different colored hair pattern to it that
Interesting.
came down to its chest here and hunched over its chest. And then a little bit on the, oh, it was like the whole top of its head, and it kind of trickled down to some of its shoulder and its chest, like a honey brown color. And then the rest of it was almost like a brown, like a dark brown, like very contrasting.
Yeah, almost kind of like a vitiligo or something, where it was like
Yeah,
a skin something that was, you know, splotchy.
A pattern that, yeah, it was a pattern that you would think that would have something like that. And from what I remember, I think it might have been both shoulders, head, both shoulders, and then it seeped down into one of the chest, the pecs. That was very interesting. Like the hair pattern, that is really something. I'm trying to think of what else. But yeah, so as far as all that stuff with the witness sketch, you find that people, I was talking about how it's kind of switched gears when they're hesitant to give me a bunch of information, then all of a sudden they're bombarding me like, nope, they won't settle for anything but what they saw now, because this is their one shot, their one opportunity, and they're going to take it. So suddenly they're the captains of the ship, and now they have this, they have a confidence to them, and it's such a good thing, because a lot of times they go into this process very hesitant and resistant, because they're not crazy about revisiting their experience. They don't want to take this deep of a dive into what this creature looked like. They do, but
they probably don't want to look it in the face again.
But there's part of them that really does, but the process to get there, they're just not sure if they can do it. But again, I know we keep using the word analytical, but it's the best way to describe it. But once they realize how analytical the approach is, suddenly it's almost as if they're getting to experience their encounter a little bit more removed, especially emotionally more removed than they ever have been. And so with that, they're able to dig. And so they're saying, right, go this, and nope. And then from one point to the next, you turn around and show them, then it's like, oh God. Then it's almost like a punch in the gut, right? And it's almost like a boxing match. You're like, yeah, I got to stuck him, And like, yeah, wow. Okay. So if you were just to blah, 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 and blah, 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 and suddenly it's not like this, it's like, okay, this, and then you do that.
You're very close.
Yeah. And then you turn it around and it just gets more and more, and oftentimes it ends when they're in tears looking at this thing, and so you see that's pretty normal. There's that roller coaster of, I'm not sure I want to do this. I'm finding my power in this, and it's now or never, to like this whole, like settling into this emotional experience.
Well, I think also people who I've talked to, people have told me encounters that happened 40 years ago, and they've never told anybody since it happened. There's a certain amount of closure. And, you kind of like, I don't know what I saw. It's not supposed to exist. I guess it's a Bigfoot because that's what they're described, but I don't know. I've never seen a Bigfoot before. There's all this doubt. And I think to have it on paper, to be able to look at it again, it's kind of like, it's now I can be like, yeah, turn it around. This is what I saw, and then you can compare that to others. And yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people who have a traumatic experience with these things, is to kind of have that closure of being able to look at it again, being able to confront it. But like you said, it's like at the zoo, I'm able to look at the gorilla, but it's from behind glass. I'm able to look at the tiger, but it's behind glass, and I can stand there and I can study it. I can stare at it. I can look at how it moves and everything else. It's not where we're both on the even playing field and they can destroy me anytime I want. So I think that's kind of a very important mental closure thing, is that they get to see it again. And for all the people that they've been described, or sometimes like what I was saying, people who haven't told their encounter before, they're too scared to tell people because they can't put a finger on what they saw. And if you get the description, 99, 95% right, that's a big deal for them, because now they have something,
There's
they
a
have
few,
something other than just what's stuck in their head. They have
yeah.
a physical something,
And it does a few things. Well, first off, a lot of them won't even share it because they work for universities or law enforcement or for the fire department or you name it, and they, where saying that you witness something like this may not ride. They may have significant others who may say this isn't going to ride. There's layers and layers to it.
Right.
I try not to generalize witnesses and how they process it, because it's always different, but there are reoccurring things that seem to happen often, more often than none, one of which I find one of the main reasons witnesses benefit from this kind of thing is because what a lot of people don't realize is, even if the witness saw this thing right in front of them, it was your friend that literally ran right into this thing, right there.
Right.
This was right there. I saw it. A lot of witnesses still, because we're not hardwired to accept something like this quickly. It's going to screw you up mentally, especially if you go in blind. So their mind is still trying to fight against it, even though they know what they saw. They'll still spend sometimes years trying to convince themselves. I think it could have just been a very big native man, a very, very big, hair-covered, giant, black-eyed, oh God, but there is this cycle, there's this mental resistance because we're not programmed to accept something like this, especially when you go from 0 to Squatch in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah.
So again, going through this process, I think I mentioned in the last episode about how Claudia's daughter went into the sketch session saying that she doesn't remember that much at all, but she remembered 10 times more than Claudia did. And it was because she had this newfound confidence of, like, I'm not afraid to talk about this right now. If I'm going to see this, it's going to be right now. And when she's talking about it, she's remembering more things and more things and more things. And there's something throughout the process, I think, that clicks in their head where they stop and they go, yeah, this happened. Like this, seriously, no bullshit, this happened to me. And it wasn't a giant native man. It wasn't a giant gorilla. It was exactly what I said I saw. And this is clarification for me because, yeah, I saw those eyes. I saw this Browers. They're looking at this thing now and they're understanding, like, yeah, I saw all of this. I just put this together using, and there's this breakthrough, and it's this, like you said, it's this closure. They know what they saw and they know it's real, but we're human. And as intelligent as we think humans are kind of dum-dums that, like to categorize things and like to humanize things. And we have to categorize and place things into certain boxes in order for us to really fully digest and accept what's going to fit to our personal narratives, which is always different. And then we go sharing information based on these narratives, and then everybody's just, whatever. And at the end of the day, it's like the only clarification that you're going to have is your own personal clarification. And there's something about this process that really helps people do that. Really quick, before I move on, there's something very important I want to mention. There are artists within the Bigfoot community that have been doing this kind of work way, way longer and way better than I have. There's a woman named Alex Evans who has been doing witness sketch work for, I mean, years and years. I just spent a couple
The name sounds familiar. Oh,
if you saw her drawings, you would know right away. You say, ah,
right.
I know her work. Her drawings are much better than mine's are. Is that a word? Than mine's are. But Alex Evans, Sibylla Christine Irwin is another artist who's been doing this type of work for a long time. And it's not just about the results of their work, it's about their approach that they take to their work and their process and how it's catered to witnesses. Anybody could say, I do witness sketch work, or I work with witnesses, and yeah, but are you really doing that, or are you just drawing the picture of Bigfoot, using
Right.
using your creative senses here? Like, what is your process here? Like, there's artists out there whose process I've admired, some of which I've adopted certain things here and there. Alex Evans, Sibylla Christine Irwin. There's a gentleman by the name of Harvey Pratt who works with David Paulides quite a bit.
I think I've heard of him, or at least I think I've seen his work before.
Yeah, he's an actual forensic sketch artist. Like, if me and him were on an airplane somewhere and somebody jumped up and said, my child has gone missing. I don't know about the airplane. It's probably a bad analogy. We're in a restaurant somewhere in some city and they're like, oh, my child's been missing and we need to find them. We need somebody to sketch this kid. He's going to be able to do that, not me. I'm not, I wouldn't have the confidence to say, I've done this before and blah, blah, blah. That's what he does. He's the person that's like, this person robbed me and he had facial hair and all that stuff. He would be able to remove the facial hair based off of the knowledge of all this kind of stuff. He's somebody who also does witness sketch work. I mean, we talked about, I was talking to somebody how it's a blessing when you have people that specialize in certain practices or sciences that really give this subject the time that it deserves. Your
right.
Late Dr. John Badernagels, your Jeff Meldrums, like all these different people. But Harvey Pratt is probably up there with one of those, one of them. Peter Travers is another one who's done witness sketch work for years. So if you like what I do, go check out what they do, and I'm sure they have much longer, much more intense stories than I do. So yeah.
There's one thing that never ceases to amaze me is no matter how many times I hear somebody's description of a location or even photographs of the location, somebody's description, they have photographs, maybe they have video, maybe there's somebody else's video of the area that's completely not Sasquatch related. Until I actually get out there in person, 9 times out of 10, I'm like, wow, this is nothing like I pictured. Like, oh, this thing was looking in the window of my house and I'm picturing a cabin in the woods with trees all around and I'm picturing a single story. And then I get out there and there's no trees around and it's a 2-story house. And, it's just amazing to me that in the field work, when you get out to these locations, how different it can be than the mental picture or even times a year. Like if you look at Claudia's video, the very first video I did, I don't know, a year and a half ago, and the very first time I went out there, she even turned to me and said, it doesn't look anything like the video, does it? I'm like, no, because we were out there in fall, she was out there in spring, the trees were really full, and when they weren't, and it's just, even from time of year.
Yeah.
But I think that's one thing to consider for people. Say you're going to go to a trail where there's an encounter or an area that's really famous or a hot spot, or back to a spot that you had an encounter. Keep an open mind. There's no such thing as a wasted experience. 99% of the time when I go out to a place, I never get anything cool. I never get rocks thrown at me. I never hear tree knocks. I never see a Sasquatch, but it's never wasted because I'm looking for tracks, possible water sources, food sources, nuts, squirrels, birds, human traffic through there, egress, game paths, whatever. There's so much information that you can bring in by going out to these locations that has nothing to do with a direct, like, I'm going to this spot and I want to see a Sasquatch. It's like, yeah, that would be nice, but it's probably more or less going to be getting an idea of what it was. Kind of like we were saying with Claudia's encounter, since you went there too. From the trail where that tree is, it's almost eye level with the trail.
Yeah.
It's not till you kind of go down on that hillside and you look up and you're like, dang, it's a big tree.
Yeah.
And it's really high up there.
Yeah.
And that's even just from a different, from 25 feet away on the trail versus not. So I think that's something for people to take away is when they hear, when they hear a description, when they see even a video or a picture, if you can get out there yourself, you might be surprised by what you found. Or some of these areas, like, it was in this field and it was going from tree, and then you realize there's a big road and there's a shopping center right across the street. Or how remote something can be, or how surprisingly close something can be. And I always tell people too, a really good resource is Google Earth. You can go on the location and kind of pick things out. Before I ever go a spot I've never been to before, I look up on Google Earth, and even from that, like, oh, it looks like this from Google Earth, and you get out there in person, and you get out there and you're like, oh, wow, this is nothing like I thought it was going to be. It was nothing like they described. It was nothing like Google Earth, and it was nothing like the pictures. And the famous Patterson-Gimlin site, 50 years ago, going across that, Bluff Creek there, if you've seen photos and pictures of it, it doesn't look anything like the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Right.
And people show me a picture of it, or, oh yeah, I took a pilgrimage and hiked out there, and they show you some film of it, and you're like, no, sure? That's not it. That doesn't look anything like it. Then you see the log and some of the trees in the background, and you kind of get that perspective. So yeah, I think that's really important when it comes to field work and investigating after the fact. And a lot of the locations I've been to, every once in a while I hear something or see something or find something that's interesting or gets the crap scared out of me. But most of the time it's more of passive. What's the plausibility? How close are we to houses? What are the food sources? Do you think this would be a good spot certain times of year? Are they moving through? Do they think there's a resident population? Studying animals that have absolutely nothing to do with Bigfoot, like killer whales. Killer whales are fascinating because they're very large, very smart mammals. They're predators. Yeah. That sounds a lot like a Bigfoot, really, large, predatorial. They live in family groups, but whales have a language. Whales also have something else known as they have transient and resident populations, and they eat different things. They have pods of killer whales that go all over the earth, and they have ones that live in one area their entire lives. They have different ways of communicating. Their diets are completely different, and we extrapolate that and think about another highly intelligent large animal like Sasquatch. Maybe there's resident populations, maybe some migrate, maybe some have a different food source. If it's a mild climate and there's a bunch of farmland with corn and deer and everything else around, why would I leave? If it's a very rugged, subalpine, very rugged subalpine terrain where I'm going to have to work my ass off to eat one squirrel, maybe that's good certain times of year, but not others. Maybe it's so freaking cold up there. Why would I be up there in the winter? So that's for a note to investigators. Just use your common sense, use your bigger idea of biology, think outside the box. And like I said, yes, the whole world knows a clear video would be great. A picture would be great. But doing a forensic sketch, I think, especially after the fact, well, I can't take a picture of it and go back in time. I think it's really important. And I think it's a very good puzzle piece that you're creating for people, like in the Claudia Ackley encounter, to go to the site, to hear the testimonies of her and her daughters, to look in the area at other encounters that have happened, look at annual snowfall, look at all that kind of stuff, and it kind of really paints a picture. And I think, the $64,000, the big question is, what are these things? Everybody wants to focus on the creature, and your drawings give a big focus to that. And I actually get off into minutia, and I think it's fascinating to look at their environment and where they were seeing, like roadside encounters, and literally there's a Walmart on one side and a Home Depot on the other, and there's some farmlands nearby, but you're like, what the hell is a Bigfoot doing here? But multiple people saw it, and it's been seen before. So, I think location and context is very, very important. Otherwise, it's just a picture.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, next time we talk, I definitely want to get into more encounters other than the Claudia Ackley encounter within that whole area.
I just got an extension. Basically, I thought I was going to have to pick up my kid. My wife just went to do it. So if you want to talk for another 15 or 20 minutes, we can.
Okay, let's do it. I'm in.
Yeah. So what do you want to talk about? The other strange stuff in Southern California, or specifically Big Bear? Because there's kind of a whole big picture being painted here.
Yeah. Well, why don't you ease us into it? Where do you think would be the best place to start? What about what do you know about the Big Bear area? I know.
Well, the Big Bear.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Big Bear Lake Arrowhead area is a mountain range in Southern California. It's kind of for the locals here in Southern California from LA, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino County. It's our place to go ski or go rent a cabin. It's the local mountains, essentially. And from most anywhere in Southern California, it's about an hour and a half to 2 hour drive, depending. It does get a lot of traffic.
Super touristy, yeah.
One thing that's very interesting to me going back historically, the reason why, and this is important, at least I think so, why it's called Big Bear, because there's kind of there's a bunch of little towns up there. There's Running Springs and Fawnskin and Crestline and Big Bear City and Big Bear Lake. And there's a bunch of little sub-communities up there because it's actually a pretty big area up in these mountains. And it's fairly high elevation. I think Lake Arrowhead is 6,000 feet and Big Bear Lake is 7,000 feet, fairly high elevation. They get a good amount of snow, kind of why they're known for their skiing. One thing, the reason why it's called Big Bear is there used to be grizzly bears up there up until the early 1900s. There were no black bears. And Big Bear, because they had particularly large, right, and actually most people don't realize that California, we had our own, this is why I study bears and bear attacks. There's a reason for it. Because they're a very large 1,000-pound carnivorous creature or omnivorous creature that moves around. And that sounds a lot like a Bigfoot. So I think there's a lot of things you can delve into the Bigfoot subject by looking at other species, kind of like the whale analogy I went into. Anyway, so it's called Big Bear because they used to have grizzly bears up there. And the subspecies that lived in California, the one that's on our flag, that is now extinct because we shot them all, is the California grizzly. The California grizzly doesn't hibernate like you think grizzly bears in Montana or Wyoming do or in Alaska because we have such good weather that they would just move lower down. Bears really only hibernate when they lose a food source. In fact, there's even documented cases of bears not hibernating in extremely cold areas because they were following wolf packs around and scavenging off the wolves. Typically when a bear starts running out of food sources is when they'll go into hibernation. So California grizzlies were 1,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds. They rivaled Kodiak bears. They were a particularly huge species of grizzly bear, or brown bear. So you got to have a large food source for that, which is interesting because I guess the Big Bear Lake Arrowhead area was crawling with grizzly bears 100 years ago. Tons of them. And we've since shot them all out. Grizzly bears have a very low reproductive rate, as do most large animals. And we shot them all out. They're extinct. Years later, the Forest Service introduced black bears up there. And interestingly enough, the black bear population every year goes up and up. They're doing really well up there for a lot of the same reasons the grizzly bears did well. There's plenty of seeds and nuts and fish and deer. And now that there's a large human population, garbage, there's plenty of food sources for these black bears to eat. Black bear, 300 or 400 or 500 pounds at the biggest. And, that's always a good indicator to me. Someone says, do you think there could be Bigfoots in these areas? Are there deer? Are there bear? Are there mountain lion? Is there a water source? If the answer is yes to most of those, then yeah, there could probably be a Bigfoot, They're much smarter than a bear and they live there, much more resourceful anyway. So yeah, you look at the background of being able to support large creatures up in Arrowhead. And then you look at the next mountain range over, which is divided by the 10 freeway. That's the Idlewild mountain range, and where Pine Cove is, where I've spent a lot of time. And that's another equally surprisingly large area of mountains. And they have a lot of Bigfoot sightings. And then and right across, like I said, just a few miles away is the Arrowhead Big Bear mountain range. They have a lot of Sasquatch sightings. What's behind northeast of Big Bear. A lot of desert, nothing. Well, out there is 29 Palms Air Force Base. And there's a lot of reports in Palm Springs, 29 Palms, Palm Desert, of something called the Yucca Man. It was a 7-8 foot tall blonde Sasquatch running through the desert. And it was well documented through the 70s. The Air Force bases and the bases out there had a lot of contact with these creatures coming up there. We're talking low water, desert heat, and these things are being spotted. It makes no sense, morphologically, but these things are seen out there. And then you look at the LA mountain range, which is like Wrightwood and all those different areas. And really, what the Idlewild mountain range, the Big Bear mountains, and then the LA mountains, and then the Sierras, they're all very, very, very close. There's kind of one little valley and a freeway that separates all these mountain ranges. So, which is also the Pacific Crest Trail, the trail that takes you from Mexico all the way to Canada. It runs all the way through California, then up through Oregon and Washington. And it does that exact thing. It goes through the desert, past the Salton Sea, through the foothills, through the Idlewild area, then down through the valley, up through the Big Bear area, then across through the valley, then up through Wrightwood, and then through Tehachapi, and then you're in the Sierras. So you're like, well, if humans can hike this, and they do all the time, every day, a large creature could potentially migrate thousands of miles, could do it under the cover of darkness, could use its cunning and camouflage. There's lots of ways to pass under roadways and everything else. And in fact, the Idlewild mountain range in the last few years has bears again. There was never bears up there, but now they have bears. They said, where the bears came from. They walked over from Big Bear, Arrowhead area. At one point they crossed the desert, went across the freeway, hiked up to the mountain. There's so many bears in the Arrowhead area that these bears decided, let's go to those mountains, Yeah. So when you put that together, and then when you look at, you go on the BFRO website, which me and you talked about, is very limiting. It's a good place to start. If you've never been to an area, it's a starting point. Then you start looking at documentaries, you start looking at Sasquatch Chronicles, you start going on YouTube now, and you put in Big Bear or Arrowhead, and all these different encounters start coming up. You start talking to people. Well, through Claudia Ackley, I met a couple of people who lived up there full time, and they had these things in their yard. We were talking about that. They don't want people on their yard to film them. They're very private people, so there's been I get a lot of information from them, but I don't want to push them to go film or prove anything or anything like that. And like I was telling you, it's very interesting. The neighbors up there, and by the way, this is less than a mile from where Claudia Ackley had her encounter. It's a very nice house in a very rich, well-to-do neighborhood in Arrowhead. And these guys have these things in their yard running across the street, and they're scaring the crap out of these guys all the time, looking in windows and going in their koi pond and all that other stuff. Talking to them, then shooting off from them, talking to their neighbors, and then talking to other sets of neighbors. The neighbors are like, did you see the really funny looking bear walking on 2 legs that was 7 feet tall with no nose, no snout? It's like, how far do you have to stretch the definition of a bear to say that wasn't a Sasquatch?
Yeah.
And this whole community of these things running through hillsides and through yards and back areas and everything else, is it certain times a year maybe, or are they full time? I don't know. They're probably following deer or whatever they can, And then you look at Big Bear, which is probably another half-hour drive further, 15, 20 miles away, same mountain range, but down the road. And there's lots of reports there by Big Bear Lake and some of the back trails. And I've heard reports of aggressive encounters there. I've heard reports of people seeing orbs. There's one real famous one where a guy was sitting on the tailgate of his truck smoking a cigarette, and he sees this orb of light, this volleyball of light just go through the woods, and he's just kind of like, cigarette falling out of his mouth, like, what was that? And then a minute later, a Bigfoot runs by, and he's like, by the time he picked his cigarette back up, this Bigfoot's running by, and everybody laughed at him. Well, the thing was, he had other neighbors who were laughing at him who saw something else peeking in through their windows. Yeah, did you see the big, giant, 7-foot tall native guy or dark-skinned guy or whatever looking in through the window? And it's like, no, that was a Bigfoot, So and then there's also a few cases of missing people up there, missing 411 type stuff. Idlewild, where I've spent a lot of areas, there's a particular spot called Black Mountain, Fuller Ridge Black Mountain. It dumps you off onto the Pacific Crest Trail. There's been a bunch of people gone missing, or they literally there's one last year where this guy went missing. They literally found his truck running in the snow, but the guy was missing, and they found him a few weeks later. Classic missing 411 stuff.
Wow.
You know, I've had weird experiences up there, and this is all a hot skip and a jump. And then south of the Idlewild mountain range is Anza Borrego. I have a video coming out this week about the Borrego Sandman and the orbs of light and all the high strangeness stuff that happens in Anza Borrego Desert. So Southern California, there's this whole patchwork, generally kind of following the Pacific Crest Trail, of strange stuff, orbs in the woods, Bigfoot encounters. At lower elevations, you don't hear as much. In the higher elevations like the mountains, but in the deserts and high deserts, you hear dogman encounters. You hear them all throughout there, especially through Palm Springs and Palm Desert, and off the 10 freeway, off the 15, the Salton Sea area, and the Borrego. You hear stories of these dogmen, and when you go out there, it's kind of this picture, something like that, because there are mule deer populations and farm animals. Yeah, and it just kind of paints this picture of high strangeness that if you want to be scientific and analytical, and you know, there's no woo, as they say, there's no BS, it's BS, there's no paranormal stuff, Bigfoot's a flesh and blood creature, there's plenty of evidence to support that in the Arrowhead area, specifically Arrowhead Big Bear mountain range. And for as much traffic as Arrowhead gets, people coming through, tourists, cabins, rent, skiing, it's a big mountain range, and that's in a very thin strip along the highway. Yeah. And there are a couple trails here and there, but there are massive, massive amounts of mountains up there that you can see, but hardly anybody ever goes to. It's impossible to get to. There's no road. There's no trails. It's just open hillsides and countries and mountains. And excuse me, if something wanted to hide or run away or sneak down at night or migrate through, there could be its own little ecosystem and its own little areas that it goes through in the summer and winter time, just in the Big Bear Arrowhead area itself. You know, I think right with the lake that's kind of on more on the backside of the mountain, there's been a number of encounters there, and I did an investigation there. And the thing that struck me about that lake was how much trash there was. And I'm like, you know, how many half-eaten hot dogs and pizza boxes were around. Of like, that was a Bigfoot. I'd go through there and live off just that. Not to mention there's fish in the lake and deer and everything else. Yeah. You know, so it really paints a picture of, it's like, look, if there's a patch of woods, it seems like every patch of woods in America, even here in Southern California, even Santiago Canyon was really close to me, and the Santa Ana mountain range here in Orange County. Seems like every patch of wood in America, every little mountain range has its story of a Bigfoot or some kind of a boogeyman or some kind of a monster or something out there. And some of it's just tales, but a lot of it's rooted in fact. Someplace at some time, somebody saw something that's not supposed to exist. You know, like the whole thing about this being traumatic. Monsters aren't supposed to exist. So, hey, Michael, can you draw me the picture of the monster that I saw that's not supposed to exist? Yeah. You know, it's really painting a picture, especially in the Arrowhead area, in the greater Los Angeles area, Southern California, and then the Sierras where I go all the time. And how I said, if you look at a map, these mountain ranges are very close by, only separated by a thin valley. Mm-hmm. And, you know, going all the way to the coast, you know, like the Tejon Pass and Fort Tejon, those areas have a long history of Sasquatch. Going all the way towards Santa Barbara and those mountain ranges, people see them out there too. And if you think cover of darkness, being stealthy, you could literally go anywhere in the state, whether it be desert, beaches, very well populated areas, and doing these corridors of green. And yeah, I mean, and that's not one thing also to consider is you could go to a spot of an encounter or multiple encounters. You could go back 3 days a week for 2 years and never see anything. You know, just because they were there then doesn't mean that they're there now. Yeah. Yeah. So, and those are just kind of the things that I've worked on the last few years, especially when you start looking at a lot of the desert and high desert encounters. the whole area in Southern California, you know, going all the way down to the border guards have tons of stories of seeing dogman and Bigfoot creatures running around in the desert.
I noticed that too.
And if
Yeah.
you go down to San Diego, the very famous story about the dentist who had them on his property, and he called them zoobies. And they're basically in the hills and mountains down in the San Diego area of these things running through, like Julian, where the apple orchards are, the little mountain town down in San Diego County. They've had sightings down there. And even driving through Temecula, you just see these big, giant mountains, and there's nothing up there.
Yeah, nothing.
You know?
Yeah, you're right.
There's plenty of areas for these things to move around and live. They can go bother people, or they can go hide out. They can do whatever they want, you know? And even in, you know, California with 40 million people, to have this concept of we've been everywhere and see everything. It's like we stick to these very well-traveled paths, and that's about it.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's plenty of room, even in areas that are as heavily populated and well-traveled, for these creatures.
I feel like we're fooled into believing we know more than we really do, and that we understand more than we really understand. Before we get going, I was wondering if there's any story within that area, within the BigBear, Lake Arrowhead, Southern California area, that has always kind of stood out to you. Is there one that constantly kind of picks at the side of your, you know, the back of your head, anything like that?
Well, yeah, between Claudia's encounter, the people that I mentioned that live up there that have them fascinated with their koi pond, looking into windows, to the guy smoking a cigarette, seeing an orb and a Sasquatch. One, I don't know why it always sticks out with me. There's a fairly somewhat known encounter, and it happened right on Highway 39, which is like the big main road going up there. It was in broad daylight. His mother and daughter, I think, were not Claudia, but mother and daughter were driving to school or something like that. And they look off on the, you know, one of the little sides of the mountain road, and going up this hillside, they're like, Mom, is that an enormous man? It was broad daylight, like Tuesday morning, 7:30 in the morning, right on the side of the highway. They see like an 8-foot tall, hairy brown looking creature or man, like kind of scruddling up this mountain hillside.
Oy. And
the mom saw it, the daughter saw it, and they were just like, what? You know, people that have lived up there their whole lives have never seen that before. You know, like bright morning, Tuesday morning, middle of the day, right on the side of the road.
Yeah.
And you're like, you know, then you think, well, maybe the creature got stuck, or maybe it was sick, or maybe it was just like, humans are always looking at this little thing in their hand. They're never going to notice, you know? And so you hear stories like that, and you get multiple witnesses, and then as the crows fly, it really wasn't that far from where Claudia saw her stuff. You're like, shit, people are seeing these things legitimately. Even if you threw out half the cases, even if you threw out all of them but one, well, one time somebody saw one, you know, something very real going on up there. And I think I'm only kind of scratching the surface. So I'm going to continue to go back up. I'm going to continue to do filming. And even towards the back side of BigBear, kind of that long road at 230, whatever that road is that comes way back down, that dumps you out in Redlands. Parts of that road get up to like 9,000 feet. And there's streams and tons of mountains back there. And that's really the side less traveled. I want to get back there and do some filming and looking around. So yeah, it seems like you could spend a whole lifetime exploring that area, you know, never find every little trail, never find every little meadow, you know, never find every encounter spot.
Yeah.
So seems like there's a lot to do up there.
Yeah, and it's a little gold mine of encounter stories up there, from the couple you had mentioned that had the koi pond in the backyard, to this married couple that had the daughter visiting them that daughter home from college that was chased down that same trail. I forgot about that one. I completely forgot about that one. Well, also kind of, you know, at one point in time after Claudia's encounter, her car got broken into. She called the sheriff's department. The sheriff came to her house, and she was wearing like a Sasquatch shirt. And I think she noticed him like looking at her shirt or something. And she said, yeah, I'm the Sasquatch lady. I'm the lady that says that she saw the Sasquatch in the trail, da, da, da. And she said that
I
usually,
remember the story. Yeah.
yeah, that people would kind of look at her and go, "Oh God," you know. But she said that he was very intrigued and said, there's this older lady that lives off the base of that trail, and she's constantly calling my officers because she says that there's monkeys going through her trash and looking in her windows, and it's getting really, people are getting really agitated by it. They just think it's because she's just this old kooky old lady, and but suddenly he was paying attention. He's like, whoa, this is interesting,
Yeah,
So
and it's kind of like that trail, Claudia, and then the people I mentioned who live nearby. There's this whole community of people that, I haven't talked to many of them, but the people I have, everybody has a story, and they talk about them very matter of factly as, oh, I don't know what they are. I don't know if they're Bigfoot, but whatever it is, it's going through my trash, looking in my windows, that kind of stuff, And a bunch of them up there. A bunch of people say the exact same thing, like the 7-foot tall bear with no nose that runs across the road on its hind legs. It's like everybody has some kind of a story, And that's one thing I've learned through investigations, talking to neighbors and people that I encounter is, you ever see anything? You ask them, oh, all the years you've been in the woods and lived up here, you ever seen anything odd? They will always say no, and they'll always say but. No, I've never seen anything odd, but this one time, all my chickens were missing, but the chicken coop was latched shut, or I thought it was a man looking in through my window in the middle of the night, or I found these really big footprints. I don't know who's running around on my property with size 18 feet, barefoot, but I've never seen anything odd.
Nothing odd.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you could see it in their face. Sometimes you could see it in their face as they're saying it. They're like hearing themselves, and they're like,
Yeah, it seems like every old timer, Forest Service guy who's lived out there, I've been hunting for 30 years, and Bigfoot is BS. And they say, have you ever seen anything odd? No, I've never seen anything odd. Within 30 seconds, they're telling you a story of a strange light or some knocks, or they got rocks thrown at them one night, or something weird happened. But no, nothing weird ever happened.
Yeah.
It's it's always the same old stuff.
Do you still keep in contact with anybody, any of the witnesses out there? And do you know if there's any ongoing stuff currently?
I haven't talked to him in a couple of months, but yeah, the one guy who I described looking in his window, him and his spouse, the Bigfoot's looking in the windows and going through their koi ponds. Every 3 or 4 months, I contact them and keep in touch. And I've had them call me just at a random time going, hey man, how you doing? I'm doing good. Just to let you know, it's sun's going down, but it's still pretty light out. And I'm looking at 2 in my front yard right now, kind of a thing, And, I'm just like, oh, okay. Like, what do you want me to do? Kind of like, I'm curious, but like at the same time, I'm like, I don't know, go bake them a pie. What do you want me to do?
Get a picture. Did they also get good looks at the faces and stuff of the creatures?
Oh yeah. Well, they've seen them looking through windows and gotten, we can talk offline. Maybe I can get you in contact with them if you ever wanted to sketch.
That's kind of what I was kind of hitting towards. I would love to, just because I've already drawn 2 other creatures in that area, and it'd be interesting to kind of see,
Well, they were introduced to me through Claudia Ackley. And what was interesting is hearing them and Claudia describe a smaller one that looked juvenile, a more mid-sized female type one, and then a bigger alpha, hearing them kind of like what you described. And I remember them talking. I remember them talking and Claudia talking that even some individual features, like it was the same family group or the same ones that Claudia saw.
How about that, huh?
Yeah. And then I think at certain points they described, 4 or 5 of them being on their property. Like, oh, there's 2 off in the bushes. There's 1 over here. Maybe Claudia just, came, maybe there was more there that day, the ones that ran across her daughter in front of him, who knows what ran across behind him, I mean, that's what a lot of people, especially because everybody knows the encounter. I reference it a lot. The Patterson Gimlin film, classic, going across. People asked, well, how come Bob Gimlin and Roger Patterson didn't follow that one? And they said, well, they weren't worried about that one, but they could hear and see other creatures off in the distance. And they're like, well, we were out in the open, we're fine, but like, we're not going to go into bushes after these creatures, especially since they knew that there were other ones around that they saw physically and they heard.
I could be wrong, but I think Bob Gimlin said something about that even they saw different track sizes as they
Oh,
were
yeah,
on the way
he
up, so they
described
kind of
that.
knew.
Well, yeah, they knew there were big ones and medium-sized ones and little tiny ones. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how
Matt, let me put it on hold for just 1 second. I have a little visitor coming to see me here. How are you, Bubba? I'm doing a phone call right now. I'm almost done, though. Probably a good point to start wrapping it up here. With the kids start coming in. Awesome. Talk to you soon. Thanks again. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Mattsquatch from Mattsquatch Presents. I'm Michael Montoya for the Drawings of Bigfoot. And I have no outro line. Goodbye.